If I were to ask you to name the most important people in human history, who would you go for? My guess would be an emperor like one of the Caesars, or a dictator like Hitler, or maybe a warrior like Napoleon. But though they changed the world in their time, how much can their impact really be felt 500, 1,000 years later down the track? People in power changed the world for a generation, but people with ideas changed the world forever. And today we're going to get to understand the person who completely rocked medieval society. In a time when the only celebrities were kings and queens, how did a lowly monk have such an impact that 400 years later, a new ideas leader would adopt his name?
Because I have a dream.
What exactly did he do? Why is he still famous? Why is he hated? Why is he loved? Who was Martin Luther?
Hello there.
So Martin Luther was born in Germany in 1483. Now this is important because it roughly marks the end of Europe's Middle Ages. And so the medieval feudal structure of king, noble, knight, peasant was starting to become a little bit more blurry, and Luther's family existed somewhere between peasantry and nobility. You see, his dad was on the local council, but they were far from rich. So with a little more freedom over what people could do for work, Luther's dad decided that young Martin should attend university and become a lawyer. Now, fast forward 22 years, and on the way home from university, Luther is caught in a lightning storm. And so he does what many would do, he prays. But he doesn't pray to God, but instead he prays to St. Anna. And so this is where I'm going to put Luther on pause and explain the medieval church. But remember this, we are up to the lightning storm because this lightning storm changes history. And so the medieval church was actually very different to most churches you might know today, and in some ways is actually even different to the modern Catholic Church. Here's how. Number one, they could pray to the heroes of Christianity, otherwise known as saints. So Martin Luther prayed not to God, but to St. Anna. Number two, they believed in a place called purgatory where people could go before heaven to have their sins purged, hence the name purgatory. Now this was not a pleasant place, and if you were a bad Catholic, you could be here for thousands of years. So people wanted to avoid purgatory. Number three, you could actually pay money in exchange for time off in purgatory. These were called indulgences. Now, does this sound like blatant corruption? Well, yeah, it pretty much was. Number four, you reached heaven by, yes, having faith that Jesus died for you, but by also doing good works so that you become ready to enter heaven. The theory was this, you needed to be perfect to enter a perfect place, so it wasn't until you became perfect either on earth or through purgatory that you could enter heaven. And now number five, and this was by far the most important, everything we know about God comes, yes, from the Bible, but from also what the Catholic Church says. Now, why is this the case? Well, basically because the Catholic Church has the authority to interpret what the Bible says. So are you surprised to hear that this was what the medieval church was like? Well, that's because you're living after Martin Luther. So back to his life. Luther prayed to St. Anne and said, if I get rescued, then I'll become a monk. And so sure enough, he made it out of the storm safe. He decided to ditch his law degree and he became a monk. And 5 years later, this is 1510, Luther took a visit to Rome, the sacred city. Now, if the Jedi had Coruscant and if the Hunger Games had the capital, then the medieval church had Rome. It was considered an honor to visit the center of the Catholic Church, but when Luther rocked up in Rome, he was absolutely gobsmacked. You see, he was expecting to see the most holy and obedient priests, but what he found was actually the opposite. He found that the Catholic Church was at one of their darkest points in history, and even Catholic historians admit that the medieval church was rampant with corruption. Priests were supposed to be celibate, but for decades the Pope himself had taken several mistresses. Jesus himself spoke many times about the evils of greed and obsessing over money, but the church was running as a mega business. Indulgences were being sold left, right and center to fund all sorts of things. They were funding wars, palaces, church buildings, and even the Pope's over-the-top lifestyle. This was not what Martin Luther had signed up for when he became a monk. And the corrupt church had a sinister salesman, Johann Tetzel. He was so good at selling indulgences to poor peasants, and this was his trademark sales pitch. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Basically, if you give us your money, your relatives will get out of purgatory and go straight to heaven. This was basic corruption, this was basic manipulation. And so in a rampant act of rebellion in October 1517, Luther nailed a list of 95 problems he had with the Catholic Church to the door of his church in Wittenberg, and the Reformation had begun. Well, actually, the truth is probably a little less dramatic. Luther likely never imagined he'd become as famous as he is today, but he was living in a time where everyday peasants could now become celebrities. He was living a few decades after the European printer was invented. So after Luther nailed his 95 issues, a pamphlet version of them was copied and printed all across Europe. The 95 issues covered many topics, but they mostly focused on the church's manipulative use of indulgences. Luther had become an overnight celebrity, and his message resonated with many people. Why could the Catholic Church manipulate people so badly? Why were millions of innocent peasants having their money stolen? How on earth could God be okay with any of this happening? Luther had gone from an innocent monk to a leader of the largest rebellion in the history of medieval Europe. He wasn't attacking a king or a kingdom, he was coming after Europe's holy church. But Luther didn't just stop there. As he continued to read more and more of the Bible, he started to challenge the church in other areas too. As he read the book of Romans, he started to question the idea of being good enough to enter heaven. In the 3rd chapter of Romans, he read that there was not one person good enough to enter heaven, but that Jesus died for those who were not good enough. In what he called his eureka moment, he realized that it wasn't about doing good works that mattered, but having faith in the one who was good enough, and that was Jesus. Now remember those 5 points about the medieval church from the start. Luther, though he likely didn't intend to, had effectively raised the middle finger to the last 3, and holy moly did this upset the powers that be. In 1520, the Pope threatened Luther with excommunication, that's basically getting expelled from the church, unless he took back all of his writings. What did Luther do? Well, he burned the letter that the Pope sent him, and the Pope responded by following through and excommunicating him. What's also important is that Luther was living in the Holy Roman Empire. That's modern day Germany. And the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy called Charles V, was super Catholic. Now, Charles had Luther arrested for heresy and he put him on trial. If Luther was found to be guilty, he would face the medieval punishment for all heretics: being burned alive. Stay tuned for part 2, where we find out Luther's fate at the trial for his life. Make sure to subscribe and hit notifications so you don't miss out, and we'll see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.